This is part 2 of my Super Paper Mario review. It's recommended that you watch part 1 before this. Part 1 went over the story, but even though that's done, there are still major spoilers for the entire game here. You have been warned. In this part, I'll be discussing the rest of the game, starting with the visuals. So for the visuals, a lot has changed. The game is primarily 2D, while the previous games were entirely 3D with 2D characters. Now I do love 2D games visually, but this is where things get a bit sloppy. The art direction in this game is so bizarre, but in conflicting ways. Sometimes the strange art style is really cool, like with some of the character designs and some of the odd stuff you'll see in the background, like random equations using Mario symbols. But the world design itself doesn't do anything interesting. There are some cool locations like the Sammer Kingdom and the Underwear, but most of the other locations aren't all that unique. There really isn't anything here any more outlandish than anything in other 2D Mario games. So if they were trying to be super strange because you're in different dimensions, well, other than a few places, they didn't do it very well. Mario is already pretty weird, to the point where it's standard. So to be bizarre in comparison, you'll need to do more than this. But the biggest issue with the art direction is tied into the gameplay. Everything is flat. Getting ahead of myself, but the main mechanic of the game is you're in 2D most of the time and can transition into 3D. But because of this, the worlds look very flat. Even in 3D, it's flat. This could have been cool if going in 3D made the world as detailed as in Thousand Year Door, but it doesn't. These mountains you'd think would be 3D are just flat background decorations in 3D. Same with houses. It really doesn't make this world feel alive. It feels way more artificial this way, like none of this is real. Like it's a level, not a world. And I'm not one to complain about games being gamey. I get annoyed when people use gamey as a complaint. But when making these worlds and attempting to make you care for them, it helps to not make them feel like artificial levels constructed just for the purpose of platforming through. The game is divided between different dimensions, and the idea is each dimension has a different art style. But this leads to some consistency issues. And I don't mean the issue is them being inconsistent, it's that they are too consistent. There are things shared between nearly all dimensions, including enemies, the usual Mario blocks, these sub-areas that come right out of the original Super Mario Bros. On NES, and these doors. These doors really bother me. They stick out like a sore thumb. Not just because nearly every single dimension has them and they don't change to match the art style of the area. I think Castle Black and Flipside are the only places you don't see them. But because it just adds on to the game feeling artificial. In the previous games, the worlds were connected more naturally. To get to the next screen, you walk through a narrow transition path, which implies that the next screen is right next to it. But here, the worlds aren't connected in natural ways. Instead, you have these dumb doors everywhere, not even connected to anything, that warp you to where you go next. Why are there just these universal magic doors everywhere, across multiple dimensions, that just connect to random places? Kinda reminds me of the warp gates in Mischief Makers, but I'm okay with them there since, well, for one, they actually do more interesting stuff with them mechanically, but we're not on gameplay yet. But they are also more contextualized in universe. And the whole game is super bizarre to begin with, and pulls it off much better than here. But enough about doors. As for the theming of the worlds, as I said, they have different art styles, but for a lot of them they don't look differently enough. I could buy that Gloam Valley is in the same dimension as the Line Lands. Same with Outer Space, though it is different enough for the others. As for the actual theming, this game is a bit half and half. Some parts are more standard Mario themes like Line Land, it's just grass and desert. The only visually interesting part of space is the Woe Zone, which is really cool looking. The over there is just clouds, and then there's the Bitlands. It again is very standard Mario stuff, but pixelated. I love pixel art, but this just isn't very appealing. It's just made up of a bunch of big squares, and unlike actual pixel art, they don't blend together, which makes it look cluttered. It's as if there's a grid over it at all times. The only interesting part visually here is Fort Francis, but even then I find it's lacking. Francis is supposed to be this mega geek, the nerd to end all nerds, and I guess living in a castle would be pretty nerdy, but aside from a couple rooms in it, there's not a lot of nerdy stuff here. If it wasn't for those 2 rooms and all the cat robots, this would just be a standard castle level. This place should be full of video game and anime posters, piles of comics, shelves full of figurines. Why am I not platforming on a stack of games? Why am I not fighting robots robots using a zapper as a weapon? Why isn't there a room full of arcade cabinets that he's collected? Such a missed opportunity. But there are some really cool looking locations. Gloam Valley looks really nice, and while the land of the Crackdons is basically a desert and cave, the caveman theme makes it more appealing. The Samur Kingdom is beautiful, probably my favorite location visually. I wish we could see more than the same arena copy and pasted, and having the place just all blank when it's destroyed is very striking and effective. The underwear has a great aesthetic to it, and Castle Black looks really cool too. It's very simplistic, but that makes it work so well. Like I said, about half and half on the theming. Now for the character designs, this is where most of the bizarre aspects of the art style come from. While some of the worlds don't feel different enough to really sell that they're entirely different dimensions, the character designs sure do. These are nothing like anything we've ever seen in a Mario game. This is something I was a bit mixed on for quite a while, but over time I've come to really like just how weird these designs are. It's hard to describe. A lot of the NPCs are made up of shapes, and it can feel like it's a mess visually, but the strange nature I think adds to the charm. The new enemy designs can be pretty cool, although we have a clash of art styles here. Some enemies are exclusive to the chapter you find them in, and they fit right in, but there are a bunch that appear in multiple chapters, and they don't fit in. Why do these square things appear in all these different places? Why are there Cursias everywhere? Okay, so looking at Lineland, this is what the natural residents look like. Okay, then you have the unique enemies to this game, like the Squiglets. Sure, I could see these things being a part of the same dimension. Ignore that Squiglets appear in almost every dimension. But we also have Goombas and Koopas here. Why? They do not fit in at all. They aren't even the same art style. When it comes to major characters and bosses, oh man, they have some great designs. I mean, look at this guy. And this guy. Count Black's design is just cool. He's so classy with a top hat and monocle and his cloak which opens up and looks like this. Like, this might just be my favorite character design in the series, it's so good. Oh, Chunks is more on the bizarre side. Similarly to the NPCs, I think it has a charm to it that may take some time getting used to. Mimi being a shapeshifter leads to some cool stuff. Her transformation into her true form is just creepy. The only issue I have with Mimi's design is her limbs are just black lines, which I get why they did that. It isn't an issue with the design, it just doesn't work well in Castle Black. They blend into the background, so it just looks like she's a floating head in dress. Speaking of which, every time you see Mimi, she has a different dress on. Kinda weird, but it fits her character. Both her personality and the fact that she's a shapeshifter, so constantly changing her appearance is kinda her thing. You know, when it comes to character designs, I think Super Dementio best represents it. Like, look at this thing. It's so bizarre and strange, but it just looks cool. A shortcoming, though, involves animations. Characters are animated in a similar way to Thousand Year Door, which is kinda limited. I didn't bring it up there because it didn't have much of an impact there, but here with the more dramatic story, I think it could have really benefited from more advanced animation. Though they really do make the most out of what they have. Even though it's just a simple pose, when Black pulls his hat down covering his eyes, it really conveys how much grief he's going through, especially in some scenes like when he confirms that Timpani is still alive. And even Nastasia, her simple poses and animations convey a lot. Like in that same scene, the moment Dementio says the name Blumiere, just look at Nastasia. I know it's very simple, and honestly it's the story and dialogue doing most of the work here, not these very simple animations. They still add just a little bit more, though they could have added quite a lot more if the animations were more advanced. Now, one thing missing from the game visually is paper. There's even less paper effects in this than the first game. The aesthetic seems more digital than the pop-up book style of the previous games. What with things like actual mouse cursors and transitions. You'd think changing it to 3D would have an effect like the flipping curse in Thousand Year Door, but no, the effect is more digital. I guess digital is the best word to describe the aesthetic of the game as a whole, while the previous games felt more natural. I guess it makes sense with being different dimensions, so it should feel different. It's an interesting style this game has, but one I think has more cons than pros. It has some cool character designs and locations, but it also has some boring locations with untapped potential, and the biggest issue of everything looking flat and arbitrary. While it has some great aspects to its art style, I think it's overall the weakest visually. The previous games were just nicer to look at. They were detailed without being cluttered, they felt like real places in the world, and they weren't flat. But the soundtrack though, oh man, this soundtrack is phenomenal. Honestly, it's one of the most underrated soundtracks. It doesn't get nearly as much credit as it deserves. There's plenty of variety, each area sounds distinct, and it always fits the mood. Land Land Road is upbeat. The underwear is spooky. And the woe zone is wacky. One thing this soundtrack does really well is complement the story. Thousand Year Door also did this really well, but we have a much more emotional story, which means the soundtrack is also very emotional, and it is really effective. I already mentioned World of Nothing and how it really sells the destroyed Samur Kingdom. Then there's the River Twigs. This is actual music in a Mario game. Count Bleck has several versions of his theme. Which is also shared with the Chaos Heart. My favorite versions are Count Bleck's Plan. And Champion of Destruction. This one also plays after you beat Count Bleck, and it is such a good track for this scene. But speaking of Bleck, Castle Bleck is really good as well. Really nails that feeling of time is running out. There's urgency, but also a hint of sadness. And if you listen closely, you'll hear a clock ticking. But when it comes to emotional tracks, you can't beat Memory. During the Blumiere and Timpani sections, this plays. Pretty simple, but as the game progresses, the track expands with more added to it. Until at the end, when they finally reunite and it transforms into this. Chopping onions whenever this scene plays. I could go on for hours, so let's just highlight some of my favorite tracks. Mansion Patrol, which is one of the mini-games, has a really underappreciated track. Of all the worlds, the one that has my favorite music is the Sammer Kingdom. But of course, there's a lot of great boss tracks. This has to be my favorite Bowser theme. Of course, Bleck's minions all get multiple great tracks, my favorite of which is Brobot L-Type. But of course, there can only be one, and just like the last game, I think the title of best track in this game has to go to the final boss theme, The Ultimate Show. This soundtrack is a masterpiece, even better than Thousand Year Doors, and I stand by that 100%. This isn't just my favorite Paper Mario soundtrack, but my favorite Mario soundtrack in general, and it's my second favorite soundtrack of all time. It's really good. There are so many other amazing tracks I left out, but we gotta end somewhere before I just play the entire soundtrack. And this review is long enough as it is. So how about we finally move on to the gameplay. The first two Paper Mario games were RPGs, with turn-based combat. The battle system was great, and had fixed pretty much all the issues I ever had with turn-based combat. Thousand Year Door took the already really good combat of the first game and expanded on it, making it even better. So you'd think a third game would expand even further on that. Well, time to throw out everything you knew about the gameplay of those games, because this is the aspect that was changed the most. Super Paper Mario isn't an RPG. It doesn't have turn-based combat. Instead, it's a 2D platformer with some RPG elements. This was quite a controversial move. Obviously, this isn't what Paper Mario fans wanted out of a third game, and as such, this game is often seen as the black sheep of the series. One could say that this is only Paper Mario in name, and it wouldn't be hard to make a compelling case. So they completely changed the gameplay. That's really disappointing, but is the new gameplay any good? There have been plenty of sequels that changed the gameplay completely and ended up being even better, but unfortunately, this is not one of those cases. So let's get into it. As I said, this is primarily a 2D platformer, and it's on the Wii, so you control it with a single Wiimote on its side, which limits the amount of buttons there are. But the game is rather simple in control, so it hardly feels like it needs more buttons, though there are a few few instances where having more would be convenient. Over the course of the game, you'll have 4 playable characters: Mario, Peach, Bowser, and Luigi. Each of them have unique abilities. Mario controls like you expect him to. You can jump, and that's about it. There isn't even a run button, weirdly, but I'm fine with that. He has one unique ability from the rest, and it is one of the central mechanics of the game. Shortly into the first world, Mario gets the ability to flip into the 3rd dimension. The main purpose of going into 3D is finding hidden objects and paths. Some objects will be 3D, while others will stay 2D, and you won't be able to interact with them. It is an essential ability that is required for much of the game. It is a cool idea, however it has some faults. They don't make good use out of it most of the time. It mostly boils down to finding hidden paths, which would be fine, but for the majority of the game the level design does nothing to hint that you should be flipping in a given area. There are times when it is obvious, mostly when it's in the background, but not always, and there's like never any time it properly hits to something in the foreground. It's not a huge issue the entire game, but for some levels you may be wandering around them for a while trying to find out where to go, only to discover you needed to flip in this one spot. I guess they expect you to be constantly flipping and checking every area, but the problem with that is only Mario can do it. Only one out of the 4 playable characters can use it. But also, you have a limited time to use it. After this meter depletes, you take 1 point of damage. It also resets if you take any kind of damage. Now, it is only 1 point of damage, but it is still limiting, and the game is designed within those limitations. Both of these result in the ability not being used in many interesting ways. It's mostly just to find hidden paths, not much else, and it actively makes it annoying to use. If you don't want to take damage, you have to go back into 2D, and wait as the meter slowly builds up. Otherwise, you need to take damage. And since Mario is the only one who can flip into 3D, if you're playing as another character and get to a point you need to flip, you then need to swap characters. You swap characters in the same way as the previous games. Pause, go to the character tab, and select the character. If you press both 1 and 2, it just opens up the character menu, which is pretty convenient. Peach is a little slower than Mario, but she has 2 unique abilities. One is to use her umbrella to hover across larger distances. Her other ability is if you hold down, she will use her umbrella as a shield, and while she's doing this, she's completely invincible. Nothing can touch you. Bowser is big and slow, but he makes up for it by having double the attack of everyone else. And by holding down, he breathes fire, which is very effective when fighting enemies. And Luigi is similar to Mario, except he can jump higher, and by holding down he will fold up, and releasing it will make him do a spring jump like in Thousand Year Door. Although in this game, it also acts as an attack, which can be quite broken. The idea of these characters is pretty cool. They each have unique abilities that justify using them. None feel useless. But there are some issues with the execution that tie into other aspects of the game, so I'll get to them as they come. You don't have partners. The closest equivalent to them are the Pixls, which give you even more abilities, and each of the characters can use any of them. You always have Tippy out. To use her, you need to point the Wiimote at the screen. Time pauses while you're doing this, and this allows you to tattle enemies, and get hints just like Goombario and Goombella in previous games. You don't see enemy health bars when using it though. It's just to find out their stats and get some flavor text. You also use this to see invisible objects and make them visible, but this ability isn't used very often, so it's easy to forget about. In the post-game, you no longer have Tippy for obvious reasons, which means you no longer have her abilities. But you can get them back by going to Francis. He has invented Tiptron, a robotic replica of Tippy that thinks she is the real Tippy, but at the same time is somewhat aware that she is just a replica, which is kind of messed up a bit. You can buy Tiptron from Francis for 999 coins, and she acts exactly like Tippy did. For every other Pixel, you can only have one out at a time. You need to switch out the other Pixels in the same way as the playable characters. The first one you get is Throw. You throw them forward, which can activate switches, and pick up items like Kooper and Koops. You can also pick up objects like blocks or even enemies, and you'll hold them over your head, which you can now throw them to activate switches or defeat enemies. If you throw an enemy, they won't take damage, but it will be stunned, unless you throw them at another enemy, in which case both will take damage and it pierces defense. Not all enemies can be picked up. Some are too big, or if they have a spike on their head, it will hurt you.
Careful now, Boomer.
Boomer is similar to Bombette and Bobbery. It's just a bomb you place to blow up blocks and damage enemies. though here you just place him down, he doesn't walk forward like the others. Slim's required uses are very situational. You turn sideways just like that one curse in Thousand Year Door, which allows you to go through small openings in the same way. But the main point of him is if you stand still, you become invisible, and nothing can touch you. It's mostly used to get past obstacles in the same way as Lady Bow or Vivian, but here you'll have free movement. You'll take damage if you're moving, but it's still faster. Needless to say, this destroys any challenge there could have been. Thudley is a ground pound, pretty simple, nothing much to add. Carry is similar to Lackluster. You ride on it to get over spikes while moving faster, but you can still jump while on it, which means you can use it to jump on spiked enemies. Using Carry and Bowser is a deadly combo since it increases his speed and allows him to breathe fire while jumping. Carry is probably the most useful Pixel. Fleep is probably the most useless required Pixel. His only purpose is to interact with these weird rifts, which there aren't a whole lot of. Oh, he can also stun enemies, I guess, but who cares really? Did anyone ever need to do that? Kudge gives you a hammer attack. Pretty simple, it's an extra way to attack enemies. It makes it easier to hit spiked enemies, and it does more damage. It could also break big blocks. And the last required Pixel is Dottie, who is also very situational. She shrinks you down, allowing you to fit in small gaps and enter tiny doors. Movement speed and jump height isn't changed, so it can be used effectively in combat to make you harder to hit. In addition to those, there are 3 optional Pixels that you can get for doing side quests. First is Barry. He creates a barrier that protects you for a second and hurts enemies. That's it. It can be useful, but with all the other options you have, it really doesn't stand out. Dashel gives you a run button. That's it. It's faster than Carry, but doesn't have the advantages she had. It's neat, I guess, but it's not all that special, especially with what you need to do to get it, but I'll get to that later. And finally, there's Piccolo, who changes the sound of your jump, also gets rid of a couple blocks, and can heal any status effects you might have. Now, with all of this, you are quite versatile, but this is a case of having so many options and not enough reason to use them all, at least in combat. Why bother using Thoreau, Boomer, Thudley, Kudge, or Barry, when simply using Bowser and Carry will be more than enough to defeat any enemy with ease? Bowser's Fire Breath is ridiculous, and combining it with Carry is downright overpowered. I suppose I should go over the combat. It's obviously not turn-based anymore. Instead, it acts like how it does in any 2D Mario game. You jump on enemies to hurt them. Now, this is all well and good. This is a 2D game after all. But unlike most platformers, enemies don't just die in one hit. They have health. To defeat enemies, you'll have to jump on them multiple times to deplete that health. The amount varies from enemy to enemy. You could have some who are weak enough to die instantly, or take forever to kill. Let's talk about fighting enemies in 2D platformers. In most 2D platformers, you defeat enemies by jumping on them. The reason for this is simply pacing. 2D platformers are usually fast-paced. Not all, of course, but the ones that are slower-paced tend to have different design goals from Mario. The purpose of enemies is to be an obstacle you quickly overcome, like any other obstacle, not something you spent a lot of time fighting. Jumping on enemies works best as a way to quickly dispatch an enemy while keeping your momentum, which is why it is the most common way to defeat enemies in 2D platformers. In more combat-focused games, you rarely, if ever, can attack an enemy by jumping on them, because simply jumping on an enemy until it dies isn't very interesting or challenging, but that's how combat works here most of the time. There are other ways with Pixls and of course Bowser's Fire, which is the most effective way to fight enemies, especially when combined with Carry, but the point is, combat is not very interesting. It's designed like your typical Mario platformer, but now they have health, which slows down the pace. You could just ignore enemies, but there's a lot more emphasis on combat in this game. There are a lot more enemies around, a lot more than your typical 2D Mario game. Plus, it is actively encouraging you to fight all these enemies because there's a level up system. Now, the previous games had what I consider to be the best level up system I've seen. Instead of doing that again, this game opts for a more traditional level up system. Great. So defeating enemies gives you a set amount of experience every time, which means you can more easily grind. The amount you need to level up goes up every time you level up as well. The level up system of the first 2 games, where you only needed 100 star points every time, but the amount you got from enemies decreased every time you leveled up until you either got none back or only 1, prevented you from grinding. Grinding was all but impossible in the first game, and very, very tedious in Thousand Year Door, which is a good thing as to prevent you from doing it at all. Here, there's nothing stopping you from getting stupidly overpowered. Actually, you don't even need to grind for that to happen, because they've also changed the rewards for leveling up. In the previous games, you got to pick between increasing your health, flower points, and badge points. This, in addition to giving you more strategic options in what kind of playstyle you want, also kept the game balance very consistent. See, not one of these three options increased your own attack, which means you can't just put all your level ups in attack and steamroll the rest of the game. But here, you only have two options, and you can't even choose which you want because it alternates through the two every level up. The first level will always be HP, and the second level will always be attack up. This is the biggest issue with this new level up system, and possibly the biggest issue in the entire game. This breaks the difficulty balance in two. It is so easy to get powerful that even playing the game normally, without grinding, will destroy any challenge you could have possibly gotten out of this game. Not to mention Bowser's damage is double that of everyone else, so he gets ridiculously strong from leveling up. Now, to be fair, given this is a 2D platformer, it doesn't matter too much in the main levels. But the bosses really get hurt by this, though I'll get to them later. Point is, this level up system is a complete downgrade from the previous games, and it is really unnecessary for this game anyway, because the RPG elements don't really complement the game to begin with. Last thing to say about leveling up is there is a way to get more experience out of enemies by doing stylish moves. Yeah, this game has stylish moves. After jumping on an enemy, you shake the Wii boat to get more XP. Not that you'll need to. Much like the previous games, you have items, and they still haven't changed the inventory, so you still get 10 slots, and you can't even increase it to 20 like in Thousand Year Door. Items are mostly useless since pretty much any combat scenario is so easy you would never need them. Items now use action commands. It's stuff like tilting the Wiimote correctly or shaking it, stuff like that, which just kind of slows down the pace. Once again, the best items are healing items, but even still, because the game is so easy, you won't need them as often. Plus, you can find mushrooms, including super and ultra shrooms, in blocks that heal you on the spot. The most significant new item is the catch card. There are two variants, the normal one and the catch card SP. If you use one, it will select an enemy on screen and convert it to a card of that enemy. This isn't guaranteed to work, but the SP has a much higher chance of working, where it is rare if it doesn't. You can also just find cards of various enemies out in the world without having to convert them yourself. The purpose of catch cards is kind of similar to the Tattlelog, just you don't get them by tattling. But more importantly, if you have a card of an enemy, that enemy now takes double damage, as if you needed to be even more powerful. And you can get multiples of the same card, and the effect stacks. This is getting pretty ridiculous. Enemies provide no challenge. You are given so many ways to get stronger. Leveling up, using catch cards, you can get power pluses, which permanently increase your attack if you use it. Granted, they are rare, but geez, do you think that's enough? How powerful do they think is enough? The only way you could probably get some challenge out of this game is to avoid enemies altogether to not level up, but even doing that is easy with the flipping mechanic. You just walk past enemies. I suppose I should talk about enemies. Even though you are death incarnate to them, they do have a lot more going on for them than your typical enemies in 2D Mario. If the game had proper difficulty balancing, I can imagine these enemies giving a decent challenge, even if it still wouldn't make the game super difficult. A lot of them are just like the usual enemies, including the usual enemies like Goombas and Koopas. They work like always, but there's a lot more unique enemies with their own unique properties. It still touch you and you take damage, but many of them actively attack you. You also have enemies that require certain abilities to defeat, but I don't really find them all that interesting since when you know how to defeat them, well, that's it. The Mr. Eye isn't so bad, it's a nice callback to Mario 64, and is at least doing something cool with the flipping mechanic. But these slug things, where you just make them eat a bomb, are really boring. Glad these guys are here. There are other enemies that don't take damage but require a certain amount of hits before they're defeated, but they still don't put up much of a fight. Except these flying head things. They are a huge pain to kill because they fly over the place and only take 1 damage per hit. Probably the most interesting enemies are the Curseus. There are a few versions of them that when you touch them they curse you. It gives you debuffs like making you slow, making you unable to use your character's unique ability, make you heavy, reverse your controls. And the meanest one, the one that sends you back to Flipside. Yeah, that can happen, but they're not hard to avoid, and Bowser can kill them easily. I don't get what they were going for with this combat. They obviously wanted to change things up, but at the same time keep a lot of what was in the previous games. It feels like the stuff carried over from the previous games were put there just so it could still be called a Paper Mario game, so it could be distinct from other 2D Mario games, not because it would make the game better. Now, the idea of having a platformer with more emphasized combat isn't doomed to fail. Combat in 2D can absolutely work. There are many examples where it does. But those games better balanced the combat and had dedicated combat systems. What is the combat system of this game? You primarily jump on enemies. Yes, you do have a lot of other options, but the main method of attacking is jumping. And as I've gone over, jumping on enemies is better suited to games that don't emphasize combat. So combat either slows down the pace, or is just as simple as your typical Mario game. In neither case does it provide a satisfying challenge, nor is it really that fun on its own. At least in a game like Dust, which isn't all that hard, the combat is still pretty satisfying, and it doesn't bring any other parts of the game down. But enough on combat. The game is still somewhat structured the same way as the previous games. You have a hub area that leads to each chapter. Unlike the previous games, there really isn't much in the way of a prologue. It's a big cutscene that does take a bit to get through, but once you get control, all you do is place the first pure heart on the pillar, and you're off to chapter 1. Now, Flipside is the Toad Town/Rogue port of this game, but I don't really find it as interesting as either. In terms of its layout, it is both simpler and harder to navigate. All the doors to the chapters are in the same spot, so it's easy to find, but for the rest of the place it's divided between floors. Now, it's not all that hard to get around, just that it being 2D and having the areas separated with these elevators kinda makes it a bit more confusing, especially when you factor in the flip ability to get to even more areas you can't otherwise, and it can be a bit hard to remember where everything is. In terms of what is in Flipside, you have your usual fortune teller and item shop. Item shops work exactly the same as the previous game. You get shopping points for every purchase, which can lead to rewards, and you can store items. But shops are kinda useless for anything other than storing, because the game is so easy you hardly need to buy items. And this makes money pretty useless as well. You could do the gold bar thing, but why would you ever need to? There's also an inn, works the same, pay to get full health back. No FP or star power in this game, so it's only for health. On the first floor you have Saffron, who works like Taste Tea and Zest Tea. She can cook items to make them better. She can only do one item though. There's also Catch Card Shop, where you can buy cards and card bags, as well as sell cards. Going to the basement, there is a bar where you can get some lore, and also a hidden arcade where you can play some minigames all centered around motion controls. Nothing too special here, once again they're minor distractions. There's also the outskirts, but the only things there are heart pillars. Nothing else of interest. Flopside is a mirror of Flipside. It's the same layout but flipped. And it has all the same stuff in it, but with slight differences. The only important difference is there's no Flopside arcade, and on this side you can cook 2 items at once. This kind of makes cooking more tedious, especially if you want to complete the recipe list, because if you want to cook with a single item you need to go to Flipside, but if you want to cook with 2 items you need to go all the way to Flopside. And if you want to make a few specific items, with some requiring 1 item and some requiring 2, you'll have to go back and forth between the 2. It doesn't matter too much because of how little items mean to this game, so cooking isn't really necessary, unless you want to go for 100% with the recipe list. Then, well, have fun. Anyways, you can also get a charm from Merly in Flopside. I swear they change the name of this thing every game. It obviously works differently. This time it gives you a random item from a roulette. You can also find a guy who will build a pipe back to Flipside, which is very convenient for getting back to Flopside. Now, there isn't much in the way of side quests in this game. There is no Koopa Koot or Trouble Center equivalent. After Merly moves to Flopside, you can do a traditional errand run, like the chain letter quest in the first game. You go to get an item from one character, and they'll ask you to get something from someone else, and they'll ask you to get something from someone else, and you know how this works. This one is a bit more annoying because of the way chapters are structured, requiring you to essentially replay entire levels. Twice in the case of getting to Yold Town. Luckily, Yold Town and the Yold Ruins are the only out-of-the-way places you need to go. The reward for this is getting Piccolo. But aside from that, the only other real side quest is the Pit of 100 Trials. Yeah, this game brought back that concept from Thousand Year Door, but it works differently, obviously. Instead of just having 1 fight per floor, the goal is to find the key to the door in the time limit. To get the key, you need to defeat the enemies until you find the one who has it. It's pretty simple, but this is probably the only time in the game where you might face a real challenge. It's not that any individual floor is hard, it's just you're probably going to take some chip damage along the way, and the narrow corridors you have to work with can make hitting enemies tougher. It's just awkward how these floors are laid out. You can use Mario's flip ability to get around, but you usually just want to stay as Bowser to deal as much damage as possible. But he's a bigger target, so you get hit more. It's not too bad, but it's not all that fun either, and just gets to be rather tedious as you go on. At least there is some challenge to it though. This is the only real reason you should stock up on healing items. Every 10th floor is a breather with a chest, but unlike Thousand Year Door, where each gave you a unique badge or even upgraded your inventory, here all you get are catch cards of your pixels. At the bottom is a boss I'll talk about later, but your reward is getting Dashel, which is cool I guess, but not really worth the trouble getting. Though to be fair, I could say the same about the badge you get at the bottom of the Thousand Year Doors pit, and that pit was significantly harder. Now the Pit of 100 Trials is at the bottom of Flipside, which means Flopside has its own Pit of 100 Trials, which you can only access after beating the Flipside version. Yeah, 2 Pits of 100 Trials. This one is basically the same as the Flipside version, just a little bit harder. The enemies are all shadow versions, and the layouts of the floors are different. You still don't get any decent rewards for each 10th floor, it's still catch cards. But these ones are of the first game's partners, which is a pretty cool throwback. It is pretty tedious having 2 pits when doing one was already tedious, but guess what? Apparently, they didn't think that was enough. Once you complete the Flopside bit, the boss of it doesn't show up, and he forces you to complete it a second time. No, seriously, you have to complete the Flopside pit twice to get anything out of it. That is beyond stupid. It would be bad enough if there was only 1 pit, but this is on top of there being 2. That's 3 pits you must complete. And the second run is exactly the same layout, no new rewards. What is the point of this? No, seriously, why is this a thing? Who thought this was a good idea? What does this even add to the game? Has anyone ever gotten here and didn't think this was stupid? Alright, so you do it again, fight the boss that I'll get to later, and the reward is more catch cards, this time of the playable characters. However, the Mario card comes with a special attribute. It allows for Mario to stay flipped forever without taking damage. Now that is a cool upgrade, but the problem is it's not worth going through 3 pits to get it. Sure, it's nice to not have to worry about the time limit anymore, but you won't be getting much use out of it unless you go out of your way to do it as early as possible. The game is designed with the limit, so it's not going to really change much when you get it, so it is just not worth it. I like that they brought the concept of the pit back, but the execution is just worse in every way. Unless you really want to go for 100%, it is just not worth doing before or after beating the game. If you do it before, like I did, you really destroy any challenge left in the game. You get a lot of level ups doing this, and it makes the final chapter way too easy. So it's better to save it for after the game, but that means you don't even get to use the reward. It's just dumb. Side content is not good in this game, like at all. As for the main chapters themselves, they are structured differently from the previous games. Instead of having a path area, a town, and a dungeon-like area, each chapter is split into 4 mini-chapters. So instead of Chapter 1, it's Chapter 1-1, 1-2, 1-3, and 1-4, just like the original Super Mario Bros. And this is also representative in the actual gameplay of it being more like a typical 2D platformer. Each mini-chapter is basically a separate platforming level. Some of them contain towns, but towns in general aren't very common. The gist of what you'll be doing is simply making your way through the levels to get to the exit block. But it isn't only as simple as going right, there's more puzzle solving and exploration required for these. While all the characters and pixel abilities you have are pretty redundant for combat, they do get quite a bit of use for exploring and solving puzzles. But this does kind of slow down the pace a bit. You'll have to very frequently switch characters as well as pixels, and it gets annoying after a while. Now, true, in previous games you would have to change partners every now and then, but the difference is the pacing of the games. This game being a 2D platformer means the pace overall is inherently faster, so having to pause to swap things out hurts the pace more than the first 2. Plus, you have 2 things you need to swap out, your character and pixel. while in the previous games it was just your partner. I think this game would have benefited from not having a single sideways Wiimote as the controller, and instead having one with more buttons, and that could possibly let you swap characters with a single button press. Did you know this game was originally supposed to be on GameCube? No particular reason I'm bringing that up. Now, this isn't a big deal in the slightest. It just is slightly annoying because you want to have Bowser out at all times for general combat, and because he has the best dialogue and cutscenes, which are frequent. So you also want Carry out to make him faster, so you'll have to switch between them often. Although speaking of cutscenes, that's another thing that slows down the pace. I've already talked extensively about the story, but this game is very wordy, meaning you do get into some rather lengthy cutscenes in between chapters, or even in the middle of chapters. Now, this isn't too much of a problem, one, because the story is very good, so I don't really find it all that intrusive, and it's also not unbearably long. It's just it does have a bit of an effect on the pacing. The general gameplay, while not as fast-paced as your typical Mario game, is still decently fast-paced, especially when compared to the previous games. Yet the story and dialogue pacing is more in line with Thousand Year Door, so there's a bit of a clash there. Not that I think it's wrong to have a bigger focus on a story in a 2D platformer. In fact, I would most certainly prefer the game as it currently is over version, which had another simple Mario story, even if the pacing would overall be better, because the story adds a lot more than it takes away. But to get to the individual chapters, Chapter 1 is very simple, being the first one, and also acting as a tutorial given there isn't a prologue chapter here. Though as this is a much more mechanically simpler game, there isn't much tutorialization. You gain the ability to flip at the start, and you use it often. Given you only have Mario at this point, it's more encouraging to use the flip ability since you don't have to constantly switch characters. You also get introduced to some power-ups. The coin flower rains down coins for a short time. The speed and slow flowers will increase or decrease the speed of everything respectively. While this is happening, you get tripled points and coins for defeating enemies, because you needed more of that. The Pal Pills are pretty cool. You get a bunch of 8-bit minis of you following you that help defeat enemies. If they touch an enemy, they die in one hit, but damage the enemy as well. These will also take the form of the other characters. And finally, there's the Mega Star, which will turn you into a giant 8-bit version of your character. While like this, you are invincible and will destroy any enemies and blocks in your way. It's advised to not use Peach or Bowser with it as they are much slower. This is a cool spectacle, but all you're doing is holding right, so it really doesn't add much. Kinda reminds me of the Mega Mushroom from New Super Mario Bros. It was just as uninteresting there, too. 1-2 has a town in it that you pass by, but you don't do much in it. This is where you get Thoreau, but after that you leave and the level is over. There's also these weird rectangle things that will transport you to the next platform. And aside from, I guess, looking kinda cool, I don't get the purpose of them. You do see more of these things throughout the game, but never do they do anything with them, other than them just moving you to the next platform. There's no challenge involved with them, nothing, they're just there, and I don't know why. It's not like the warp stars in Mario Galaxy, which served as spectacle, offer a small challenge in collecting star bits and massed loading. This does none of those things. Nothing much to say about 1-3 or 1-4, they're fairly straightforward while requiring you to find hidden paths, but nothing too complex. Chapter 1 is a good introduction to the game, but not much else. Chapter 2 starts off more of the same as Chapter 1, just you have Peach and get to use her abilities, as well as you find a Boomer. But then you get to Merly's mansion and it changes things up. Mimi is pretending to be Merly's handmaid, and she has various tactics to try and stop you. In 2-2, she lays traps in various rooms, pretty obvious traps with mushrooms on strings, and also a spiked ceiling lowering on you that you can easily escape by flipping. This is a pretty short chapter though. After you free this creature, it chases Mimi away, and the exit is right there. 2-3 is one of the most memorable levels in the game. You break Mimi's favorite vase, and she forces you to pay her back
1,000,000
rubies.
To get rubies, you literally need to work it off by constantly jumping into this block to power the building. Yeah, you need to keep jumping until you have 1,000,000 rubies, which by the way, takes forever. Now, you could do this. It would be extremely tedious, but you could do it. However, there's a much better way to do this. Exploring the area, you'll find some of the slaves here offering you something for some rubies. You need to get enough to pay them. One gives you access to the VIP area, where you can earn rubies much faster. But this still isn't the end. Another slave will give you a code to a vault that has exactly 1 million rubies in it, though you'll need Slim to get to it. This level is quite interesting in concept, but it's not the most fun to play through because it requires you to do a mundane task to grind for rubies. Even when going for the vault, you still need quite a few rubies to even access it. Alternatively, you could just write down the code and just get through it without grinding at all, but it was certainly not meant to be played like this. This is where things get complicated, because do I say this is a bad level because it requires tedious grinding, or do I say it's a clever concept and subversion? The idea that you get in so much debt like this that you have to literally pay it off through hard labor is pretty hilarious, but for this idea to be properly executed, it requires you to actually do the labor, do the mundane tasks to earn rubies. The concept is fun, the execution is tedious, but the concept needs the execution to be tedious. I've always had mixed feelings towards this level. It's kind of like General White from the previous game. In hindsight, the joke of it is pretty funny, but in the moment you just want to get it over with. But also like General White, it's not as bad as it might feel. And I'd say this is better executed intentional tedium because it requires you to explore to find ways around grinding out the full 1 million, as opposed to General White, which is just go to these places in this order. Plus, you could just skip past it on repeat playthroughs with the password, but you can't skip General White at all. You have to do it every time. Anyways, 2-4 is a maze. All it is trying to find the correct path. You run into Mimi disguised as Merly, trying to get you into more debt, but you reject her and she turns into her true form. And she's invincible, so now you must navigate the place while avoiding her. It's hard to navigate this place because everything looks the same. It just boils down to going through doors until you finally find the right one. Chapter 2 really shows off that this is a very unconventional game. It's going to do weird things you won't expect, and it does a good job at that. That being said, it's not all that fun to play in the moment. People say Chapter 3 is when the game picks up, but I'm really not a fan of this chapter. I think the only reason people say that is because of Francis, but you don't get much Francis until 3-4. Right away, Tippy is taken from you, so you don't have her at all for this chapter, and Barry tells you about some stuff you'll find along the way. If you come back after beating the chapter, he'll join you. 3-1 is pretty simple, not much to complain about, but not much to say either. You do fight Bowser and recruit him at the end, which is nice. But then 3-2 is a water level, and it's just kind of annoying to go through. You get Thudley, who measures your girth points, and fight a giant blooper, but other than that, it's just a water level. Nothing more to it. 3-3 is inside a giant tree. The gimmick is the switches that alternate colored platforms. The part that annoys me is it's all vertical, and falling can be very time consuming. And this place is full of crazy daisies who can put you to sleep. 3-4 is the only part I kinda like, but it still isn't very complex. It's just you need to find the passwords for 2 doors, which have the keys to get to Francis. The best part of this place is answering the security questions, but it's not a challenge at all. Every answer is yes. It's just you see more of Francis's character, which is hilarious, which elevates what would be a very standard level. You also get Carrie here, so that's a plus. Overall, Chapter 3 is either very basic, or when it does something interesting, it comes with some annoyances. Not bad, but not all that good either. Chapter 4, though, is one of the worst ones. 4-1 is in space. It's kinda cool having Squirps with you, as he lets you fire projectiles. But space is empty. It's just big empty screens that all look the same because it's in space. The only stuff you'll find are asteroids, blocks, and enemies. You transition from screens with these wormholes, but that's all there is to this level, moving around this empty place and going through wormholes. 4-2 is a little better in that it has level design, but I'm not very fond of this one either. The terrain is very rough with steep chasms that are annoying to get out of. It's hard to tell where you are or where you need to go. What you need to do is get this ancient glue and give it to Fleep, who's hogging up the bathroom so he can use it as toilet paper. And you use him to get out of there. 4-3 is similar to the first one. It's all in space and has the same issues. Only in this one, you have a big area with multiple wormholes, and you need to find the one that leads to the store so you can buy a chocolate bar so squirps can multiply and open this door. You can also potentially not have squirps while looking for the store if you inspect the door right away. 4-4 is the only good part of this chapter. It's all about changing gravity to walk on walls in the ceiling. Chapter 5 is okay, but it has some issues. 5-1 is mostly fine, just your standard level. Then you get to these blocks, and you need to hit them in a specific order, which isn't too hard to do. But then you find another set of them, and you need to hit them in a really long pattern that you'll never figure out on your own. To find out the order, you need to go back to the start and talk to this guy, and he'll only tell you after making you spell out please a bunch of times. Was this really necessary? It doesn't ruin the level by any means, but it's a bit tedious. Although you can write it down and use it on repeat playthroughs to skip that bit. 5-2 is pretty good. The main goal is to find these tablets. There are hints on these Stone Age TVs for how to find them. This is also where you get Cudge. 5-3, you're just trying to find Flint Cragley's crew to get a key. Not much really stands out here, but it does have some minecart sections, and I have no idea what the point is. They are completely automated. There's no obstacles. You can't jump. You can't do anything but wait. Why is this here? Is it for spectacle? Because it's not very spectacular. Only one of them has you interact in any way, where you go into 3D to take a different path, but this only happens once. I don't get it. 5-4 is more of the same. The only thing that stands out are the brainwashed Cragnons you run into. They try to attack you, but if you attack them, you actually lose points. I don't think you can level down doing this, but it's still a neat twist. You also get Dottie, which is the last required pixel. This isn't a bad world, but most of the stuff that stands out about it compared to other worlds are the small annoying bits. Yes, they are small, but everything else is just your standard Super Paper Mario platforming. And now we're at Chapter 6. The Sammer Kingdom, and obviously this one is completely different. This place is really important to the story, but playing through it is very tedious, which is completely intentional and kinda necessary for the story. By now you should understand why it needed to be tedious, to give you a massive roadblock with little time before the world is destroyed. It's not fun to play through, but it needs to be this way. Imagine if it was a normal level with platforming and interesting level design that's fun to play. It would greatly take away from this moment. This works because it's tedious. You are shown and told right away that the world is close to destruction. You have very little time. Okay, no problem, right? Just go through it as fast as possible. Oh, but wait, you can only have the pure heart after you fight all 100 Sammer guys. No, there's no way to speed it up. You have to fight. Each and every single one individually. Each one also feels the need to tell you their life story before you fight them too. And as I've said before, you get into a rhythm, you stop thinking about the void, then Black pulls you back into reality, and you need to run for the pure heart. You run past so many Sammer guys at this point. It's again a bit tedious, but it works so well because of that. Imagine if as soon as Black finished talking, or even after beating Mimi, the world got destroyed right there, instead of making you walk a while before it finally happened. Wouldn't be as effective, and this is the conflicting thing about this chapter. It's an excellent story moment, because it's a bad gameplay moment. All you're doing is fighting reskins of the same couple enemies over and over again. There are differences between them, but they're very minor. But that's all you're doing. It's not like Glitzville, where each fight is different. They have different requirements for each fight, and you have a much better and more interesting battle system. On top of the fact that you're not just fighting enemies the whole time. Here you just get Bowser out and hold down. Sometimes the enemies jump over you, or are too fast, but that just makes it more annoying. It wastes your time, which is the point. The reason that this is conflicting is I'm very much a gameplay over story guy. I don't think it's good for the story to detract from the gameplay. Now, I have somewhat relaxed on this, but still stand by it. And this right here is hard to judge, because this is a case where the story moment is very, very good, but only because the gameplay is hurt. This moment wouldn't work as well in a movie or book. It works best in a game, and that's the frustrating part. I don't like playing through this part of the game, but I like that I don't like it. I'm so confused. I guess the best way to put it is I like the story of this chapter more than I dislike the gameplay of this chapter, so I'd say it gets a pass. Now, after beating the game, this place is restored, and you can fight all 100 Sammer guys for real, which really means there's actually 4 pits of 100 trials. Why so many? but now the tedious nature of this can't really be defended. It's boring and you don't get anything out of it. You get catch cards, though they are of the partners from Thousand Year Door, which is really cool, but they're still catch cards. Anyways, Chapter 7 competes with 4 as the worst one. 7-1 is fine, nothing wrong with it, though it is fairly short. This is where you first get Luigi, which is nice, and you do get some good use out of him, but it's still not a whole lot given how late you get him. It's 7-2 where things start going downhill. Here is mostly vertical platforming, but in the dark. Once you get Bowser again shortly in, you can light torches to make it bright, but only for a short while. So you either need to keep Bowser out the whole time, or constantly change characters if you want to use Luigi for better jumping. You also have these door guys that give you some challenges to complete, mostly answering questions where you need to pay attention to what he's saying, or a memory quiz. The third one you fight a mini-boss, the Underchomp, but this one is in a turn-based combat style. Not the same as the previous games, but of older RPGs. I don't know whether or not to love this or be annoyed because of what this game could have been if it was still turn-based. But this level isn't too bad. But then you get to this area. Like, really? This feels kind of a bit lazy here. There's no actual challenge. But no, this isn't the bad part. The bad part is to go through this door. You need to do a favor for this hag, which is to get a book that she lent to a D-Man back. She teleports you to the D-Man, which you'd think would be helpful until you realize it's at the bottom of the level you just climbed. So you have to play through it again. Why? What does this add? And the second hag does the same thing, though at least it's not as far down, and it's optional. Thankfully, the third hag doesn't do this. That kinda kills the enjoyment of this level, honestly. And then there's 7-3, the Over There Stair. This level sucks. Everything looks the same. There are no landmarks other than these numbers on some of the clouds, so it's very easy to get lost or lose your position. It's mostly a vertical level, but also a bit of a maze. Now getting straight to the end isn't too hard, keep going up, but you need Peach to leave, and she's asleep. To wake her up, you need to find the black fruit from this tree. The only issue is, there are many different colored fruit you can find. It's not too hard to guess that the black one is the real one, but you wouldn't know that right away. And if that wasn't bad enough, even after that you run into this cloud guy who wants to get bigger, and you need to feed him the red fruit. But again, you won't know that the red one is the right one, and it's not as easy to guess as the black one. This isn't that big of a deal if you already know to hold on to the red fruit, but you wouldn't know this on your first playthrough. Someone playing this for the first time would likely be running around this place for quite a while trying to find the fruit, testing the different colors on Peach, and when finally finding the black fruit, they just continue until finding this guy and do the whole process again. Backtracking through this mess of a level, trying to remember where all the fruit trees are, which is very difficult since again everything looks the same. Also, there are paths you can only get to by flipping, and you have to deal with the inventory at the same time. The fruit take up inventory space, so that really restricts how much you can carry, and if you didn't know what the right colors to get were and picked the wrong color, that means even more backtracking. This is easily the worst level in the game. And 7-4 is also pretty annoying, though not nearly as bad. It also has the issue of everything looking the same, but it does have some actual landmarks, so navigation is much smoother. The goal is to find 3 specific Nimbies so that you can use the orbs they have to make a bridge. For the most part this level is fine, but I always have such a hard time finding the last guy, and it all boils down to hidden paths you need to flip to see. This is a bit annoying in other levels too, but I think this is the worst example of it. Chapter 8 is probably the best chapter. It does have a bit of everything looks the same, but it's not too hard to navigate, mostly because you're going right pretty much the entire time. It isn't all completely linear, you'll still have to flip to find hidden paths, and you have multiple doors to go through. You have some interesting level design and some decent platforming. You also lose a character at the end of each one until you only have Mario left. 8-2 has some of those Mimi traps from Chapter 2, and 8-3 has a bunch of Dementio clones attacking you in a few places. The only part I don't really like is in 8-4 with this 3D maze. This is one of the few interesting things they do with flipping, but the timer makes it rather annoying. Though if you have unlimited 3D, it's a lot better, but it's still pretty difficult to navigate because everything looks the same. But overall, this is the only chapter I'd say I like as a whole. Chapter 1 is just okay, Chapter 2 has some cool ideas, but isn't all that fun to play. I only like one level in Chapters 3 and 4. and 5 is okay but has some issues. Chapter 6 is a very good story moment that only works because the gameplay is tedious, and Chapter 7 kinda sucks. This isn't a very good lineup of chapters. There isn't a whole lot in them I'd call outright bad. A few things, sure, but not enough to call the game bad. But the stuff that isn't bad isn't all that good either, and even the cool ideas come at a bit of a cost. The level design is overall just decent. Nothing more, nothing less. But I suppose the only thing left are the bosses. And these are the most underwhelming part of the game. Now, the Mario platformers don't really have the best track record for bosses. A lot of the time they are very simple, jump on them 3 times to win. Now imagine those, except you have a level up system where your attack gets increased, and they don't have recovery phases where you can't hurt them, so you can repeatedly jump on them, constantly doing damage to them, to the point that even though they tend to take a lot more hits than your typical 3, they still go down very fast and easily. This is the big issue with the level up system. It completely, utterly destroys any possible challenge out of these bosses. It's a shame because these bosses could have been really cool in any other Mario game. Alright, let's go over them individually. O-Chunks is the first boss, and you fight him 4 times throughout the game. Each fight is only slightly different, but all of them are easy. You simply jump on him, but you can use throw to stun him. His attacks are fairly basic. He charges at you, jumps on you, throws things at you, and tries to grab and throw you. If he does that, he'll do a taunt, which is really cool. Kinda makes me want to get hit by this. He only gets easier since you'll be stronger. You have Bowser. In fact, the final time you fight him, you can only use Bowser, which, might I remind you, does double the damage of the others. And this is at the end of the game, so Bowser would be absurdly strong by this point, especially if you did the pits before this like I did. I was doing 56 damage and beat him in 2 hits. This should not happen, and that's the issue. The farther into this game you go, the easier it gets, because of this level up system. Earlier bosses aren't so bad. The first O-Chunks fight is fine because you wouldn't have leveled up much at all. And actually, the next 2 fights are good too because they work differently. Fractail is the first major boss, and he doesn't just have a set amount of health that needs to be depleted. You need to go to 3D to jump on his back and throw these things at his antenna. You need to hit it a specific amount of times to beat him instead of him having health. So this feels like a boss that was actually designed with a set challenge. It's still easy, but it requires effort. He'll try to get you to fall off, but with a well-timed jump you won't have to get back on. This also applies to Racktail, who is at the bottom of the Flipside pit. Yeah, just like Thousand Year Door, the boss down here is a recolor of the first fight, though this is the only one here. I don't mind it too much, but it's a bit underwhelming. Sure, it's not brain dead like some other bosses, but it doesn't do much to make the fight harder. It's more or less the same fight as Fractail. You couldn't say that about Bonetail. Right, so Mimi is the next boss. You fight her 3 times, but the second fight is different. Mimi's first and last fight is pretty simple. Instead of depleting health, you need to get rid of all her legs. To do that, you need to jump on her to stun her, and jump on her again while stunned. So level ups don't destroy the challenge. Not that it's hard, but it's still better. The final fight with her doesn't really change anything. Maybe she has an extra attack, but that's it. And you're restricted to Peach, who can make herself invincible. Although the background being black does make it a bit difficult to tell how many legs she has left. Now for her second fight, she doesn't transform, and it's over already. You see the issue here? I can't even talk about this fight because it didn't last long enough to even talk about what she does. And this is before doing the pits, and I didn't grind, so I'm not over leveled. I didn't go out of my way to do stylish moves either. This is just how broken the difficulty balance is. Demantio fights you twice, both times are basically the same, but the second time you're Luigi, who can super jump into him, making the fight easier. I beat him in 2 hits. He'll teleport, make copies of himself, throw projectiles, and so on. And the first fight at least lasts a bit longer, but still isn't too hard to hit him. And why even bother going over all these bosses? Because they all have this issue. With Francis, wait for him to appear and jump on him. With King Crocus, you'd jump on him and set him on fire. With Bone Chill, you could throw projectiles back at him, or use Luigi's super jump and completely destroy him. Like, look at this, he can't do anything to stop this.
You can fly? No. Jump good.
What can I even analyze here? Even the boss at the bottom of the Flopside pit is just as easy, although a bit more interesting since he copies your characters and your moves. And hey, Robot is pretty cool. Well, Mr. L is pretty simple, but when he brings out his big metal bro, it turns into a 2D shooter, and it's pretty fun. Still easy, and there are power-ups to make it easier, but hey, it's still fun. Probably the best boss in the game. The L-type is also a little trickier since it resists Bowser's fire and can be harder to jump on, but if you use Boomer, it's pretty much over. He can't do much against it. Wow, look, this is the first time my health even got low. That says a lot right there. Even the final bosses are nothing to write home about. Bleck has easy to avoid attacks. Some of them are kinda cool, and I'm intentionally letting him hit me here to show them off. And Super Dementio, he's slow, big, and easy to avoid. The most dangerous things in this fight are the projectiles being shot from these platforms. Keep in mind, I'm restricting myself to only play as Mario and not use Pixls. I could do double damage and beat Bleck in 3 hits, or Super Dementio in 4. Or use Peach to become invincible. Or use Slim to also be invincible. The difficulty of this game is broken. The worst part is the difficulty does kinda take away from the intensity of these situations. In the Sammer Kingdom, when you're low on time, and Mimi steps in to waste even more time, well, her fight doesn't do much to waste time when I beat her this fast. And when fighting O'Chunks in Castle Bleck, Bowser wants to fight him by himself, but O'Chunks gets bigger, which shuts Bowser up for a moment, and then I beat him in 2 hits. It's a rather weak send-off to him. When finally getting to Count Bleck, Eddie says, "Count Bleck is the deleter of worlds. My fate is written in the dark prognosticus. Do not think for a moment that I will hesitate to strike you down. All now ends. Our duel will be worthy of the last clash the world will ever see." It's super climactic. The stakes are through the roof. And the context of him also saying this to Tippy, who he loves, and did this all because of her, amplifies the intensity of the situation exponentially. And then I so effortlessly beat him. Such an anticlimax. Speaking of anticlimax, Super Dementio, what is supposed to be a supremely powerful being. Dementio is a master magician combined with the Chaos Art, an artifact so powerful it is capable of erasing all of existence, and Luigi, who is said to be the perfect host for it. And this is it? This is how little he puts up a fight? He doesn't even really use magic, he just tries to punch and jump on you. This doesn't ruin the story, but it still takes away from the moment. These are easily the worst bosses in the series up to this point. And here we are, at the end. Super Paper Mario is one of the most frustrating games I've ever played. Not because it's bad, but because it does so much right and so much wrong at the same time. It has so much potential that was wasted. As a sequel to Thousand Year Door, it excels with its story, but falls very short with the gameplay. The gameplay isn't exactly bad, but it's got a lot of flaws. Flaws that really detract from almost every aspect of the game. I can deal with some flaws in a game, even big ones, if the rest of the game is fantastic. But here, it's not like the gameplay is all that great to begin with. It's functional, it's not awful conceptually, it's not even all that bad, but it never excels at much of anything gameplay-wise. It tries to be a mix of RPG and platformer, and isn't very good at either. The RPG elements actively hurt the game in pretty much every way, and as a platformer, it doesn't come close to most of the dedicated 2D Mario platformers. Games like Mario 3, Mario World, hell, even the new Super Mario Bros. Games, all have better platforming mechanics, level designs, and difficulty balancing. But you know the funny thing is, even though as a game, any given new Super Mario Bros. Game is superior, I'd still take Super Paper Mario over them. Because even if the gameplay isn't as good, it still does a lot of interesting stuff, and I love the stories and characters and music. I'd probably even take this game over Mario 3 to be honest, because I am not very good at that game. And this is why this game is so frustrating, because I want to like this game. I do like this game, but it's not because of the gameplay. It pains me that a story this good, a soundtrack this good, is attached to a game this mediocre. I wish I liked it more than I do, more so than any other game. I wish it was better. I've been talking about the 2D Mario games, but this isn't a part of that series. This is a Paper Mario game, and when put next to either of those first 2 games, it pales in comparison. The first 2 Paper Mario games weren't just good because of the story. Those were very good aspects of them, but it was that combined with the excellent gameplay. Super has an absolutely fantastic story, the best of the series in fact, but the gameplay does not live up to either the story or the previous games. If Super had Thousand Year Door's gameplay, it would have easily been the best of the series. It would easily have surpassed Thousand Year Door itself. But it didn't, and it doesn't, and I wish it did. When it first came out, it seemed like everyone hated it. It wasn't the same as Thousand Year Door. After getting a masterpiece like that, can you really blame them when the sequel is basically a completely different game? It could have been an amazing game in its own right, but it still wouldn't have been what they wanted. Nowadays, people have relaxed a lot on it, and it isn't uncommon at all to see people say this is their favorite game in the series. And while I'm not with them, as someone whose favorite game also tends to get a lot of hate, I can respect them. And you know what? I'd rather not end this on a sour note. Even if the gameplay was changed and very flawed, there's still a lot to like here. Let's celebrate what this game did right. This is easily the deepest and most emotional story of the series, and probably the entire Mario franchise. There are several scenes that no matter how many times I watch them, I still struggle to get through them with dry eyes. The characters have depth, you really get to know them. They feel so real. And this game is just funny. Like, seriously, the writing is so on point here. I really did not talk about Francis as much as I probably should have. This whole part of the game is just hilarious. You got this giant nerd who lives in a castle and has cat robot maids everywhere guarding his man caves where he piles up all kinds of geeky stuff. And the questions you need to answer just to get in, which is only really there to know even more about Francis and just how much of a nerd he is. They really had a lot of fun writing this part of the game. Oh, and then you can only enter his room as Peach because only geniuses like Francis and totally hot babes are allowed to enter. But he's so incompetent with women that he needs his laptop to even talk to Peach. And then you get this dating sim section where he tries to woo Peach by giving her posters. And at one point, he hovers over the smooch option for a second before selecting something else. And then wants to get married. And one of the options that you can select is, how much do you make? And at this point, Peach gets frustrated at your answers and uses Boomer to blow up his laptop. And this is really in an actual Mario game, and it's amazing. And later in the game, it just rips your heart out when Loveby has to turn back into a pure heart, effectively dying to save the universe while her parents have to watch and have to say goodbye to their only daughter. This game brings out so many emotions. And can we appreciate just how wonderfully bizarre this game is? What other Mario game can you say Mario actually goes to hell, or an entire dimension gets wiped from existence, and then you fight a giant robot Luigi in the emptiness that remains of that dimension? Or one of the bosses is a little girl who snaps her own neck and turns into a spider. Super Paper Mario is one of a kind. I mean, look at this final boss. This is just plain insane. Luigi combined with some psychopathic jester and an object of universal destruction who wants to become the king of all worlds as the final boss of a real Mario game. This is the kind of stuff I want in Mario games. This was the last really creative and crazy Mario game for a while. They've certainly gotten better, and I hope this continues. But just look at this game. Look at how deep the story is, how crazy the scenarios are, how bizarre the character designs are, how emotional the writing is. Why can't we get more of this? And why does this have to be attached to this game? Oops, let that slip. But that's how it is with this game. Better appreciate the good while you still have it, because soon enough, well, I've said too much. And that's it. I'm finally done with this beast. Next up is Paper Mario Sticker Star. I'm gonna have to ask for some patience on this one. This might take a while. But before that, I'm not quite done with Super Paper Mario. I know what you're thinking. How could I possibly have more to say about this game after this video? Well, you'll just have to find out. It shouldn't take nearly as long though. So, see you there soon. Well, that was quite a beefy review. I honestly didn't think it would be this long or split into two parts. Though I guess I shouldn't be all that surprised. While ultimately Thousand Year Door is my preferred game, I tend to think about this game a lot more. Turns out there's just a lot to say about it. Oddly, the timing of this video seemed to line up with a few things. Well, not the release of it, but given the image you just saw, certain themes in this game are resonating a little more than usual with me. But I've also seen some more content from other people about this game come out while I was making it that I found pretty interesting. This is old news at this point, but while I was making this review, man on the internet made his Musical Bites series on Super Paper Mario. Basically a with lyrics sort of thing, specifically themed around Count Bleck and his minions, and I was quite impressed with them in pretty much all aspects. They really seem to understand the characters quite well, especially Count Bleck and Nastasia, and the voices were spot on. I've been listening to them pretty much non-stop since they started coming out. There will be a link to the complete package video, which has all of the character songs, which includes the 2 Dementio songs which weren't part of the series. Check it out, it's really good. And with that, I want to thank my patrons, IKG Productions, The SideQuest Gamer, Tanuki, and Enemy. If you enjoyed my content, please consider supporting me if you think I've earned it.